Joining me now, former State Department official David Seminara, who says the same-sex partner immigration legislation presents some unsurmountable problems. Good to have you with us. And Congressman Nadler, member of the House Judiciary Committee, who has sponsored the legislation for years and says it needs to be passed and right away. Congressman, good to have you with us.
Good to be here.
Let me begin with you. Federal law does not recognize same-sex partnership. Why should Immigration and Naturalization, why should that agency recognize it?
Because the United States government should not be cruel to people except when absolutely necessary, and to keep loving couples apart, to say that you can't be with your partner in the United States, or given the laws of the other country, your partner can't be with you in the other country, you can't be together at all, is simply cruel, and it's inhuman, and there's no reason to do it, and the United States government should not work gratuitous cruelty.
Mr. Seminara, why do you say that's a bad idea on a humanitarian grounds? As Congressman Nadler says, he makes a persuasive case.
Well, first of all, Lou, I'm not against the idea of same-sex marriages and civil unions, civil unions or domestic partnerships. But I think the problem with this bill is that it puts the cart before the horse, in that it creates a relationship, legal status in immigration law that does not exist here in the United States and has simply no legal standing. And it'll create tremendous opportunities for fraud in a category of visas that's already rife with abuse.
That's, with all due respect, that's nonsense. We do not have gay marriage. This is not part of the gay marriage debate. It is simply an attempt to stop being cruel to couples unnecessarily and to their children. And with respect to fraud, you can have fraudulent sham marriages now. The same protections, 5 years in jail, $250,000 fine for sham same-sex relationships for immigration purposes, will deter it exactly as effectively or as ineffectively as it deters it for heterosexual sham marriages now.
But
go ahead, Dave.
You know, that's simply, on paper it appears as though there are stern penalties for people who commit marriage fraud, but the reality of the situation, Lou, is that very, very few people ever go to prison for committing marriage fraud. I'll give you an example. In May of last year, a Lebanese immigrant in Michigan she pled guilty for committing marriage fraud, and she was actually a mole for Hezbollah. She'd gotten jobs in both the CIA and the FBI, and she was actually, she pled guilty to marriage fraud and was fined only $750, and she didn't do a day of jail time.
Well,
it's not a deterrent, because
that may be an argument for harsher penalties or better enforcement of the laws respecting sponsoring partners, heterosexual partners, but it's not an argument against extending this law to gay couples. The law should be enforced.
If I may, the U.S. conference. Sure. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dave.
Well, what I was going to say is the major deterrent for Americans not to engage in a fraudulent marriage, either for money or for other reasons, is not the threat of going to jail, because very few people ever go to jail. The major deterrent is the legal entanglements that go along with marriage. So that if I decide to marry someone in the Philippines, for example, for $10,000, what I would be most afraid of is that that person will come to the United States, and then after 2 years when they get their green card, they can divorce me and then take half of my assets. But with domestic partnerships, that threat isn't there.
Let's turn to the Conference of Catholic Bishops has come up, as you know, Congressman, against your bill, saying in part this: while the bishops support many of the provisions in the Reuniting Families Act, your decision to include in the bill the Uniting American Families Act, which would provide marriage-like immigration benefits to same-sex relationships, makes it impossible for the bishops to support this year's version of your bill. Well, let me just put it this way. I mean, do you think it makes sense to risk passage of the entire legislation?
I think that whenever there's a question of egregious discrimination against a group, you must take on the issue head on. For many years, a former Congressman, Adam Clayton Powell, used to attach anti-discrimination, anti-Jim Crow amendments to legislation, and he was considered wrong, but he prevailed in the end, and everybody now says that was the right and moral thing to do. I do think that given the small number of people involved, 35,000 couples altogether, maybe a couple hundred eventually a year once the backlog is taken care of, I hope that people, when they see the overall bill and it satisfies them in many, many ways, we'll support this bill.
Let me
I'm
ask
sure
you,
we will pass it, despite this.
Let me ask you both this, because against the backdrop, and this is the part is not under discussion, obviously, we're somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people entering this country illegally every year, including overstaying their visas. Against that backdrop of a total lack of enforcement of either border security or port security or U.S. immigration law, is this really a quibble really at the margin and one that is perhaps being overstated in its importance?
Well, I would say that it's a quibble in it.
Go ahead.
I would say that in terms of the opposition, yes, it's a quibble. It's a small number of people, and it's being overstated in terms of its importance. And given, you know, all the statistics you just cited, in terms of its impact on the country, in terms of its impact on American notions of fairness, in terms of its impact on the individuals involved, it is not a quibble.
Mr. Seminara?
I absolutely disagree with that. In fact, marriage to a U.S. citizen or green card holder is by far the most common way for foreign nationals to gain green cards. Last year alone, there were over 400,000 foreign nationals that gained the green cards in this manner, and it's also the #1 program that's subject to the most fraud. So this is by far the most common way for people living in other countries to either legalize their status in the U.S. or to come here as new arrivals. So
yes,
this is a huge...
Dave Seminara,
that's the current law. That's the current law.
Sorry,
what we're talking about,
we're
talking about is a very small addition.
Dave Seminara, thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Congressman Gerald Nadler, thank you for being with us.
You're quite welcome.